Alright, so here is the deciding game 3 that we're about to look at. Okay, so we're on the draw here. Another good starting hand. This match has we and our opponent have had solid keeps. We have that discard spell, so you'll notice that I don't board out all of my discard in the mirror, but I do also have Fulminator. Being able to get rid of those man lands later in the game and have a creature that's you're not able to actually profitably kill very well in Fulminator Mage. I do like having some number in the deck. Multiple threats, Lily. So quite a good hand. Pretty happy. It's pretty happy to see this hand. And so drew Inquisition. So normally I like starting on Inquisition rather than Thoughtseize, because you're more likely to want to, in your first discard spell, you're more likely to want to hit something that is 1 or 2 mana. So if it's, say, a Dark Confidant, maybe you hit that with your Inquisition, then later you get a Bloodbraid with the Thoughtseize. So the hand we saw, you can see it here. It's Blackleaf Cliffs, Maelstrom Pulse, Bloodbraid, Fulminator, Ooze, and then the Lily, which is what I ended up taking. So the plan here is I'm worried about the Lily because my opponent is on the play here. So if they slam a Lily and start going wild with it, that's going to be bad for us. Also, if they have a Lily on hand, Tarmogoyf no longer becomes a good play on our next turn. Whereas potentially we can still play the Goyf on turn 2 and then Thoughtseize later if we would like to. We can save the Thoughtseize potentially to hit the Bloodbraid, although we have to be worried about the Fulminator blowing up lands, and some of these other cards are pretty scary as well. So a good hand on both sides. I like taking the Lily with the Inquisition and then waiting on some of the other stuff. So here is the Ooze. Okay, so our opponent played the Ooze and the Cliffs, so we know about 3 out of the 4 cards in their hand. And so since we drew a land, we're not actually in danger. Like the Fulminator, it can be a Stone Rain here, but we're not in danger of getting mana screwed really. So I like getting the Goyf into play as a nice threat, and then we're still threatening Liliana next turn if our opponent doesn't deploy something here. So I think this works out pretty well for us. So here's something to note. You always want to be thinking about the Scavenging Ooze, and if you can, say, shrink a Tarmogoyf. So in this situation, our opponent could actually attack with the Ooze, and we don't have good blocks for it. Reason being is there is a Planeswalker and a Sorcery in the graveyard. If our opponent were to munch on those 2 cards with the Ooze, our Goyf could actually shrink down to a 1/2. So that's something to keep in mind, but it looks like our opponent just instead wanted to go for the nice clean answer in a Liliana of the Veil. So this was, of course, drawn after our Inquisition, and that's one of those things. You take a card with a discard spell, and then your opponent draws that exact card. It happens all the time. It's one of the annoying things about playing with discard spells, and it puts us on the back foot here because our opponent had the perfect card for that turn. And so this puts us in a tough spot. We drew a Liliana of the Veil for the turn. We now still know about the exact 3 cards our opponent has in hand, being the Pulse, the Elf, and the Fulminator. And I think this is a point where we can't really afford to take a turn off to play Thoughtseize. So I like playing the Liliana, getting rid of the Ooze, knowing that our opponent, if they draw an untapped land, can slam that Bloodbraid Elf, and that's going to be really bad. But this is kind of a play I think we have to make in this spot. Hope to live another day. Hope the opponent doesn't draw that untapped land. And if we're able to start going, a Lily War is kind of, both players are discarding the same amount of cards, so that doesn't necessarily favor our opponent if we both discard a ton of stuff to the Lily plus ability. And it looks like our opponent's just gonna go ahead and straight away play this Fulminator. So we have a couple of choices here in terms of what to discard. The Thoughtseize is still attractive because it deals with the Bloodbraid. We do have a Lily already in play, so that's going to hit the bin. And now we have to still be worried about this Fulminator because we don't have a great way of dealing with it. Bloodbraid is a good draw, so we've got a couple of options now, okay? We can Thoughtseize away our opponent's Bloodbraid Elf and play Fulminator, but then this Bloodbraid is gonna be gone, right? Because our opponent can either plus their Lily, or if we plus our Lily, then the Bloodbraid is gonna get discarded, as it turns out. So it's a pretty tough spot. We really have to think about this, but in the end, Bloodbraid is the most powerful card in these matchups, so I think that's where we wanna go here. And so that is going to be the plays, to just slam the Bloodbraid and see what we find. It's actually an Inquisition, which was one of the possible hits, and that's going to target our opponent. And so alongside a Lily Plus, we can actually empty out our opponent's hand in this spot. We can also attack our opponent's Liliana with our Bloodbraid if we want to, and that's going to force our opponent to make a decision if they want to trade off the Fulminator or let their Liliana hit the graveyard. And I think this is correct to block, and then debatable actually whether you want to sack then or not, whether the trade is more valuable than getting rid of one of our lands, but our opponent decided to try to cut us off red. So now our opponent has the option of making us empty-handed, but we have to get rid of our opponent's Bloodbraid Elf, which means ticking up our Lily. Our opponent has 0 cards. We have 1. So if our opponent pluses their Liliana and draws a brick, then we can actually kill their Liliana with our Bloodbraid. So interesting decision there not to trade Fulminator for Bloodbraid. I think I might have gone for the trade, just so we wouldn't actually have a creature in play, but as it stands, we do have a threat, and our opponent, we're in a top deck war, and that's what you get into. That's what you sign up for with this Jund deck. So our opponent found a spell, a good card, a Tarmogoyf. So we have Liliana in play. We could -2 it here, cash our Liliana in order to answer the Tarmogoyf. Our opponent is gonna get that Fulminator out of our hand. So we have the chance here to Edict away the Goyf, attack the Lily, and in this case it would be Fulminator and Bloodbraid Elf versus 3 lands, essentially. So we've actually found ourselves in a pretty good spot because we've been able to get creatures onto the board while our opponent has not been able to do that. And this is a spot where we could sacrifice the Fulminator immediately and just take out a land, but it's going to be even harder to deal with it long term. So I like just casting it and not using the ability just yet and making our opponent have to find some sort of an answer. Now, if our opponent, say, plays a Colligan's Command that turn, then we're going to look pretty silly for not having Stone Rained. But that's less likely, and also having another creature protects against another Liliana of the Veil if our opponent were to draw that card. So now things are looking up. We're able to get in, and it's at the point where now our opponent needs to top deck something big. One of those 2-for-1 type of cards, like a Bloodbraid, like a Colligan's Command, and just a Raging Ravine there, which Fulminator is positioned perfectly. Notice how Abrupt Decay does not actually deal with the Raging Ravine. Fulminator Mage, on the other hand, does quite a good job of answering it. So we have the option now of playing this Liliana, but we don't really have anything great to do with it. This isn't really the best time to draw it, so we can hold it and wait for our opponent to possibly play a creature so we can edict it away. And now our opponent's passing at down to 6. So this is a really good situation for us. And if our opponent does activate this Raging Ravine, I like just trading the Fulminator, getting in. And now we can use this Liliana to make our opponent discard or just pass. It's likely that our opponent just has a land, and I'm fine with this line as well. We've still got this 3-2. It's pretty likely to just finish the game right here. And it looks like that is going to be the match. And you see how many cards both players went through. And these are the kind of the games of Jund that you expect in the mirror. Just tons of back and forth. Each spell in the deck, there's an answer to. So which is why kind of you want to have the most spells, the most action, and just kind of have that last permanent on the battlefield. And we saw this Bloodbraid Elf that our opponent could have dealt with earlier on, and it just kind of sat there in play for the rest of the game, and eventually ended up finishing off our opponent